Hi, everyone. Welcome to our NTAP webinar today. I can see that the attendee list is ticking up and up, and Ross and I have a lot to cover today, so I think we're going to just dive in. Next slide, please. So we'll start with some introductions. I'm Clare Mamerow. I'm a principal at Health Management Associates. For many years, I worked for a small boutique consulting company called the Moran Company. We were acquired by HMA 5 years ago, which has been great because I've been able to continue doing my work while having now a much broader array of experts to help me out. But what is the work that I do? I lead our Medicare inpatient reimbursement team, where we use claims data, Medicare claims data, to help our clients think about Medicare reimbursement problems or issues. I do a lot of work with new technologies, a lot of NTAP work, also new DRG things, payment modeling, all kinds of anything related to inpatient reimbursement in Medicare. Ross?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Ross Margulies. I'm a partner at Manatt. Manatt is a professional consulting firm. So we are a hybrid law and consulting practice with a primary focus in the healthcare industry. My practice is focused almost exclusively on coverage coding, reimbursement, and market access for the life sciences industry. And where I've had the opportunity to work and partner with Clare for, gosh, there, I don't know, the last 10 years or so.
Oh, great.
I've been doing this for about 16 years. And, as relevant here, have worked alongside Claire in many cases with innovative life sciences and medical device companies on applying for the NTAP program. So working through whether or not this is a program that's right for you, which we're going to help try to elucidate today, and go through the actual application process and submitting those various components. So really excited to talk about this time limited program today with all of you and answer the questions you have.
Next slide. So a little bit of housekeeping. Audio and video are disabled for all of you, so feel free, eat your lunch. We won't be watching you. But that also means that you can't answer or ask questions out loud. We do really want to get your questions, though, so please put them in the Zoom Q&A feature. They will pop up on our screens. We'll be able to see them, and we'll try to answer them as they come through. If there's time at the end, there usually isn't, because we're really trying to pack in a lot of information, but we'll have Q&A at the end as well. But sort of as they come up, just send them to us so that we can answer them. Copies of these slides and a recording of the whole webinar will be available in about 72 hours. You'll get an email with the link. Personally, I love the fact that we have our own 72-hour rule here for you inpatient reimbursement inside.
I get it now, Claire. That was really good. Those are really good. Yeah.
Next slide. So what are we going to do in this webinar today? We're going to start out with sort of an overview of the NTAP program. What is it? Why is it? What are the basics? Then we're going to talk about how you qualify for the NTAP. This is where a lot of our time is going to be spent. We're going to talk about the 3 criteria: newness, substantial clinical improvement, and cost. We'll go into great detail about all of those 3 criteria. We're going to talk about sort of what has happened with the program since it began. And then we're going to sort of look at some trends and talk about what changes we think are coming in the future. And then finally, Ross and I have done many applications. We've got lots of experience. So we want to share with you our lessons learned, tips, ways to sort of approach your NTAP application so that you can sort of maximize the possibility of success. Next slide. So our overview. Why does the NTAP program exist? So when we think about the inpatient reimbursement system in Medicare, it is set up so that the hospital gets a single payment for the entire hospital stay. And this setup is incentivizing efficiency. If the hospital can be really efficient in the care that they provide really high quality care, they're going to get the same payment as if they didn't do that. And so they're sort of incentivized to provide the best care possible, discharge the person as early as possible. make sure that that care is really high quality. So that's great. We want to incentivize efficiency. The problem, though, is if we have this single payment for the entire hospital stay, and that payment is based on claims from 2 years prior, when a new technology comes on the market, especially a costly new technology, the hospital has a disincentive to use it because that single payment rate was set without the cost of that new technology sort of incorporated into the payment rate. So Congress realized that this was an issue, and back in 2000, they passed a law sort of saying, hey, CMS, you need to set up a program that looks at this disincentive and sort of tries to find a way to alleviate it. So CMS set up the NTAP program, and it said, okay, we are going to make sure that we pay for new technologies that are worth it. And so we're going to create some criteria to make sure that we're only paying for new technologies that really are worthy of this extra payment. So they set up 3 criteria: newness, cost, and substantial clinical improvement. And so we're going to go into the details of those, but I think it's important to sort of think about, in creating the NTAP program, CMS wants to sort of remove that disincentive, but they don't want to broaden the program out so much that they're paying for every new product that comes along. So they've come up with these 3 criteria to really sort of target and make sure that they are paying for the products that really are sort of worthy of this extra payment. Next
Claire,
slide.
can I add one point there, just because I think it's often a misconception about the program. We often use this term high cost, and I think when we say high cost, we really are, and Claire's going to talk about this in a little bit when we talk about the cost threshold. We are actually talking about sort of cost within the relation to the DRG payment. You and I, Claire, have worked with a number of technologies that are not high cost technologies, right? In some cases, right, where the NTAP payment may be $25, $30, but for those clients, that difference in payment, or rather for the providers, that difference in payment, notwithstanding and not being a high number, has been a significant boon for its market access portfolio. So when we say high cost here, we're really thinking about it within the context of the Medicare payment rate, not necessarily within the world of what we think of sort of as high cost generally.
Yes, excellent point. Thank you. Next slide. So how does NTAP work? We talked about the product has to qualify for that NTAP designation. And we will talk in great detail about how the manufacturer goes about to apply and get that NTAP qualification. But once that happens, then the hospital uses this new technology. Importantly, they have to remember to code on the claim that they have used this new technology. And that's actually kind of an important point, because hospitals don't put everything that happens in that hospital stay on the claim. So they actually have to remember to put that code on the claim. But then once they do, CMS looks at the claim and determines, okay, product has been used. We need to figure out what the payment for the use of this product is. That NTAP payment is in addition to that regular DRG payment, right? I talked about each hospitalization gets a single payment, get the single payment, and on top of that, the NTAP payment. But it's very important to note that this NTAP payment is not designed to cover the entire cost of the product. The hospital will not be made whole. The calculation of the payment is a little complicated. It is the lesser of 65% of the cost of the product, or 65% of the cost of the case above the DRG payment. Okay, so I just rattled that off. What does that mean? There's a couple things that you need to come away from that. One, it's the lesser of. So at the time that the hospital uses the product, they actually don't know what the payment is going to be. And because it is the lesser of 65% of the cost of the product, or 65% of the cost of the case above the regular DRG payment, there are situations in which the hospital can use the product, but the cost of the case isn't high enough to exceed that regular DRG payment, and so no NTAP payment is provided at all. And the way I sort of think about that is going back to that idea of like, why was the NTAP program developed? They want to provide hospitals with a payment if that regular DRG payment isn't enough to cover the cost of that new technology. The other thing to sort of get from that is that when we go back and we look at actual claims after the fact, we can see that it is not uncommon for the hospital to use an NTAP product and not get that maximum NTAP payment amount. It's quite possible that they will get less than that. And it's even possible that they will get no payment. And the other sort of point to come up with about this is that if the NTAP product is something that's really going to sort of, let's say, reduce the length of stay of the hospitalization, that's going to make it even harder for them to make that NTAP payment because they're lowering the cost of the case. That's the whole point of the product. And as they lower the cost of the case, it's less likely that they're going to get that DRG payment or that NTAP payment on top of the DRG payment. So it's a little bit of to me, it's a little bit of a mind bender, but if you sort of think about the incentives that CMS is trying to set up in this program, you can kind of see why they set it up this way. Now, I've been talking about 65%, 65%. Starting in 2021, CMS said, okay, there's certain types of products that we actually are going to boost that payment percentage up a little bit. For qualified infectious disease products and limited population pathways for antimicrobial and antifungal drugs.
Look at you, Claire.
Only taken, I don't know how many years to get that. QIDPs and LPADs, they get paid 75% instead of 65%. There's also, for a very limited time, gene therapies treating sickle cell disease also get that 75%. One other thing that is really important to know about the NTAP is that it is time limited. It is for the 2 to 3 year period after FDA approval or market entry. And again, if you think about why this program exists, you can sort of understand why CMS is limiting it to this 2 to 3 year period. Remember, it takes about 2 to 3 years for CMS to collect claims data, to incorporate those claims data into rate setting and update the DRG payments. So the idea is NTAP is around for that first 2 to 3 years that the product is on the market, that those DRG rates have not been updated. And then once the DRG rates have been updated, the NTAP goes away. Next slide. Ross, this one's for you.
All right. So, one of the questions Claire and I often get, honestly, around one of the reasons by the way, we time this webinar for spring is that this is a good time for companies with products, and I'll show you a timeline, I think, on the next slide, coming to market soon to start thinking about NTAP. And I often sort of ask a series of questions. Clients will say, so should we be thinking about NTAP? Should we build that into a market access strategy? And I often sort of ask a series of questions. And here are sort of some of these questions that I think are important. So Claire already talked about sort of the purpose and sort of what NTAP solves for, right? So the first piece here is this a new technology, right? So if this is a product that's been on the market for several years, highly unlikely you'd be eligible for this. So do you have, and also the focus here is on drugs and medical technology. So we're talking about biopharmaceutical products, medical devices, diagnostics. And the other key piece here is, do you expect to have inpatient hospital usage? One of the questions we often get is, we don't anticipate that the usage will be sort of significant or dominant. That doesn't exclude you from applying for NTAP, right? That's really going to be more of a business decision, which is this process and the resulting benefit of being successful in this process worth it from your market access strategy, right? So we certainly have worked with companies that have 15, 20, 25% inpatient utilization and still benefit from this process. The other question we may ask is, tell me how your product, whether it's a device or a drug, fits within the existing space, right? Is it new? Is it a new class? If it's not a new class relative to the existing class, does it offer particular benefits? Because as we will preview in a little bit, one of the most difficult, there's really two relevant pieces here that you're going to have to get across. One, you're going to have to show that your product is not substantially similar to an existing product. And then two, you're going to have to show your product is a substantial clinical improvement over existing technologies. NTAP is not just a check the box exercise, and it is not for your, run-of-the-mill new product that doesn't really create a significant change in the existing therapeutic space. So we're really focused on products that are, let's call them game changers when we're thinking about who's eligible or who the agency is thinking of for this program. Um, do you have clinical data? This is an area that I think in particular has been a difficult area for medical devices in particular versus drugs, right? Drug products come to the market typically with multiple peer-reviewed studies, often with, double-arm trials, placebo controlled trials with lots and lots of data, because that is the requirement for them to get a new NDA from the FDA. In many cases, depending on your FDA pathway as a medical device, whether it's 510(k), PMA, you may be coming to the market with relatively little comparative clinical data. That does not necessarily mean you are not going to succeed here, but I think it's an important piece to look into. And so one of the things we'll often do is, in advance of deciding whether or not you apply, take a look at your evidence and see if you're likely to meet CMS's high threshold. And then the last piece here is this cost piece. But again, and Claire will talk more through this, it's really, sometimes I think we have clients not come to us being like, we're coming up with a new $75 antibiotic. This is not what NTAP's for. That's not necessarily true, right? This is because, in fact, antibiotics are a great example. Typically, in many cases, when particularly a high, when a specialty antibiotic is administered in the hospital setting, that's typically associated with a high cost case. For example, a patient with sepsis. So in many cases, you are very likely to meet the cost threshold. One of my favorite parts of this session is we're going to show you lots of data, and I will show you how rarely it is that cost threshold, although it is a meaty part of the application, is actually a barrier to success for NTAP. Go to the next slide, which I think is going to walk you through just sort of a sample application timeline. So we wanted to give you, so this would be a timeline for what we would call sort of the fiscal year 2028 process. So this is really the next opportunity for the individuals sitting here in this webinar right now that have not yet applied for NTAP to apply, which means, and a couple of key dates I would say here, would call out here. So one, the relevant date here is the submission of a NTAP application in October 2026 of this year, right? So that was what you would be working towards in order to get a NTAP in place for fiscal year 2028, which importantly begins in October 2027, right? So we're not on a calendar year basis when we talk about the inpatient payment prospective system. So I'm not going to call out all of these timelines, but I will call out the big pieces. One, you need to submit an application in October. A preview there, the application is substantial, which means that you're really going to want to start working on this process relatively soon. Most of our clients start to work on this, I'd say, in early summer. Occasionally, Claire and I get a frantic call in September, and it is our deep plea not to give us that call, but if you do, we'll make it work. I have a couple of notes on here, that there's some options to meet with CMS. I would say in recent years, we have seen CMS moving away from wanting to directly engage with stakeholders here. So in addition to those being optional, I would say we've seen CMS increasingly sort of decline to take those meetings, and it's certainly not a required part of this process. As part of an NTAP, in order for an NTAP to be effectuated, you're going to need a ICD-10 procedure code, which you normally would not have, particularly for a drug, right? The administration of a drug in the inpatient setting is not typically a separately coded procedure, and it's not separately paid for. So there would be no need for a procedure code. The procedure for a drug, for example, maybe, if it's an oral therapy in the inpatient setting, like insertion of a oral therapy into the mouth, or intravenous administration of a drug into the musculoskeletal system, for example. In general, an unnecessary code, but because NTAP relies on, in order for CMS to pay an NTAP, they need to be able to see that code appended to the medical record. And so part and parcel, sort of a separate parallel track to an NTAP is actually applying for and receiving an ICD-10 procedure code. That application process typically occurs in early December. Also in December is an opportunity to participate in the NTAP Town Hall. The NTAP Town Hall is focused exclusively on substantial clinical improvement. So it's not about, we're going to talk a little bit more about the three criteria that Claire already previewed: newness, substantial clinical improvement, and cost. The NTAP Town Hall is an opportunity for you, it's now virtual, it used to be in person, to virtually present to a set of CMS stakeholders on the clinical value of your product and why it meets that substantial clinical improvement prong. And it's also an opportunity for CMS to ask questions. It also can be used as in lieu of these other sort of optional CMS meetings. In April, CMS will publish and we just had this, by the way, and we're going to talk a lot about the fiscal year 27 proposed rule, because as many of you who are attending likely know, CMS has proposed some significant changes to the NTAP process. I promise we will get to those. CMS will discuss all of the applications for NTAP it has received. It will and it will go through for those products that meet the criteria for NTAP and that have not withdrawn prior to the proposed rule. It will discuss each of the three prongs. I'm going to put aside the fact right now that for LPAD products, QIDPs, and breakthrough medical technologies, CMS does not currently discuss substantial clinical improvement and newness because they're not required to meet today. That could change going forward. For what's known as their traditional pathway, however, CMS goes through and discusses whether or not it believes the products meet the NTAP criteria. A really important note here, and we'll talk about this again, CMS is almost exclusively, I guess I would call it, negative or skeptical. So many of our clients call us panicked after the proposed rule comes out and say, CMS is raising all of these issues. This is a normal part of the process. CMS is trying to solicit and elicit additional information. The proposed rule is followed by a 60-day public comment period where we urge our clients and work with our clients to respond to the questions raised by CMS. An important note here, one of the gating requirements for NTAP is newness. And one of the pieces of a newness is that you must have FDA approval. So if you would like to be eligible for an NTAP starting in October 2027, which is fiscal year 2028, you must have received FDA approval by May 1st, 2027. For many of our clients, this means they apply for NTAP and ultimately are forced to withdraw their application or are not eligible based on failing to meet that FDA approval. CMS has been playing around with this date over the last few years, which has made it harder to qualify for NTAP. As you might imagine, you don't always know if you are going to receive FDA approval by May 1st. You may have a PDUFA date that gets shifted by a few days. And so in many cases, clients apply knowing there is a chance for FDA approval by that date. Because if you don't apply and ultimately receive FDA approval by May 1st, you will likely lose a year of NTAP eligibility. IPPS comment letters are due 60 days later. CMS then releases the final rule in August, where they will make a determination as to whether or not, starting in October, again, the beginning of the next fiscal year, you're eligible for NTAP.
I think the thing to see, there's a lot of things on this slide, but the thing to see is that the NTAP application, submitting that takes a lot of work and is an effort. And when you submit it in October, everyone definitely takes a sigh of relief, but that's not the end of the process. You have additional steps that you need to prepare for. So you need to think about the NTAP application process as a extended series of events, not a one-time.
An 18-month process. And I would really reemphasize here, commenting on the proposed rule is a critical difference between success and failure in this process.
Yeah.
Okay, you can go to the next slide. So I'll try to walk through these relatively quickly. I'm going to talk about newness and substantial clinical improvement, and then Claire will talk about cost, and then we'll go into some data. Newness is maybe, okay, so actually before we get that, and I think this is really important level setting for this session, but also for the latest breaking NTAP news, which is CMS's proposals in the fiscal year 2027 rule. Starting in 2020, from 2002 to 2020, roughly, there was a single pathway for NTAP, which is there are three criteria: newness, substantial clinical improvement, and cost. We're going to talk about each of those in a second. Starting in 2020, CMS adopted a policy for three types of products, that is, breakthrough medical devices, qualified infectious disease products, and whatever LPAD stands for. Claire already told you. Again, those are that they would no longer need to meet two of, frankly, the hardest prongs to meet for NTAP in order to be eligible. No longer will products need to be, they would need to be new on the market, but they would not need to be, CMS would no longer ask if they are not substantially similar to existing products. They would not, CMS would, the manufacturer would no longer need to demonstrate substantial clinical improvement. They would only have to meet the cost criterion. As you can imagine, the idea here was each of these three product categories had a very specific path and evidence threshold through the FDA. And it was believed that in order to encourage additional adoption and use by inpatient hospitals of these category types, CMS made a policy decision to essentially lower the bar to success for these products. Different reasons, right? I think the breakthrough devices have to meet a higher FDA standard to show that breakthrough status. And so CMS's idea there is that they had already sort of really demonstrated that they are not similar to existing products and that they offer a substantial clinical improvement. And then for QIDP and LPAD products, CMS has increasingly been concerned about the growing rate of antimicrobial resistance, the narrowing pipeline of new antibiotics, and felt like removing these criterion would make it easier for these products to qualify. So CMS then created these essentially two pathways. Traditional pathway, you need to meet them all. If you are one of these three categories, alternative pathway. Alternative pathway, you only have to meet the cost threshold. Really important late-breaking news. Earlier this month, CMS released its proposed IPPS 2027 rule, and CMS is proposing to repeal this alternative pathway. That is, going forward, if CMS finalizes this rule, QIDP products, LPAD products, and breakthrough devices would now have to also meet the newness, substantial clinical improvement, and cost threshold criterion. We'll talk about that. Claire will talk about that a little bit later, but we're going to show you some data on these two pathways, and I want you to sort of have these in your mind as we have this conversation. Okay, newness. There's really two. Newness is the most confusing piece because when people think newness, they typically think of the first part of newness, which is you have to be new on the market. Claire already explained why that is, right? The entire purpose of the NTAP program is to solve for a structural failure in how DRGs are built, which is the DRG is delayed in capturing claims data, so is always 2 to 3 years out of date. If your product is not new to the market, then there's no policy reason to support NTAP. So as you can imagine, in general, so I already mentioned here, so for the year we're talking about, for 2028, technologies must be approved by the FDA by May 1st, 2027, and cannot have already been in the market for more than 2 to 3 years. So it's okay. You are eligible to apply for NTAP. For example, if your product is currently being approved this month, that is totally fine. But if your product has already been FDA approved for several years, you are not eligible for product because you don't meet the newness criterion, half of the newness criterion. I want to now go to the second half of the newness criterion, which is on the next slide. The other half of newness is that you're not substantially similar to existing technologies. In other words, FDA considers the newness date to start not just when your product comes on the market, but when any product that is quote unquote substantially similar comes on the market. And we'll give you an example of this, I think, on the next slide. But and this is not like a Me Too issue. So CMS's substantially similar test is the following. CMS asks 3 questions, and you must not meet, there still must be some better way of not using so many negatives this here, but CMS will ask 3 questions. Does your product use the same or similar mechanism of action to achieve a therapeutic outcome? Is your product assigned to the same or different MSDRG? Does your product involve this treatment of the same or similar type of disease or the same or similar patient population? If you can say one of these things is not true, you can show your product is not substantially similar to existing technologies. I still somehow made this too many double negatives. Claire, you want to take a go at it?
No, I mean, the idea is if you are alike to something else that already is on the market, your
newness. So the next slide, I think, is a really good example of where we've seen this. So this is just from a couple of years ago. We had we had CMS had considered two NTAP applications during the same cycle for bispecific antibodies for the treatment of relapse refractory LBCL, which is a chronic lymphoma, and two products, one by Genmab, one by Genentech. CMS determined that both products were substantially similar because they had same mechanism of action. They would have been assigned to the same MSDRG, and they treated the same patient population. Thus, they treated them as one. CMS then looked at, because they treated them as one application, the newness date begins the date that the first product was approved. So I can't recall which one was approved first, but CMS relied on the FDA approval date of the earliest approved product. And notably also, CMS used the average weighted cost of both products rather than separate payments amounts to calculate the actual NTAP payment. They basically condensed them as a single application. So when you think about this is to say, just because your product is new to the market does not mean you are new in CMS's eyes. Very often CMS will say, hey, like, great, cool new stent technology, but are you substantially similar to this existing stent technology? Or great, a new GLP-1 on the market. But if you're using the same mechanism of action and treating the same patient population, then you're not actually new in our eyes. We don't care if it's an NDA. Okay, let's move on to probably the hardest criterion to meet, which is substantial clinical improvement. Again, NTAP is not for just any run-of-the-mill product. CMS in Congress really designed it to be a product that substantially improves clinical outcomes as compared to currently available treatments. In order to meet that, CMS looks at the clinical data you bring to market. And again, I already sort of had noted that this can be particularly tough for products. I mean, it can be honestly particularly tough for any product. Even a drug product often rarely comes to market with head-to-head clinical data against other products. And right, oftentimes it is, compared with a placebo, for example. And so you don't have great data on how you compare to currently available treatments. And so meeting this is it is a high burden of proof. CMS wants you to show clinical data that is specific or at least generalizable to Medicare beneficiary age group. They don't necessarily care, by the way, how prevalent the condition in the Medicare population is, as long as you have Medicare-specific data. And I'd say probably 5 or 6 years ago, CMS actually outlined these qualifications in regulation. So CMS will look at a number of different, they consider the totality of circumstances here, somewhat of a soft test, and they consider a range of various factors, some of which I look at here, right? You don't need to show all of these, but you need to show at least one or some of these, right? Can you show reduced mortality? Can you show reduced rate of procedure, decreased number of future hospitalizations? Again, these would typically be the same kind of endpoints you probably would show to a normal, say, commercial payer that they would be interested in. But this is the kind of data that CMS is going to really want to see. And again, they're going to want to show that you demonstrate a substantial clinical improvement over existing technologies, not just placebo. You can go to the next slide. CMS has put forward a number of sort of different ways in which the agency will judge clinical improvement. So they ask, for example, do you offer a treatment option for a patient population currently ineligible for or unresponsive to currently available treatments? Does it help you this would only be relevant for diagnostics. Does it help you diagnose a new medical condition that's currently undetectable? Or does it improve clinical outcomes? And I think here I'm sort of showing a similar set of rates. I think importantly, some clients come to us and say, hey, the FDA approved us, or the FDA approved us under accelerated approval. Like, everyone knows this, should look at FDA's press release. They said what a great job we are. FDA approval is not sufficient to demonstrate substantial clinical improvement, right? I guess I should say, except in the case historically of QIDPs, LPADs, and breakthrough medical technologies, where historically it has been. But for all other products, and potentially for all products going forwards, CMS separately looks at, does their own essential clinical evaluation of the product. I would say until the advent of the drug price negotiation program as part of the IRA, this is a pretty unique role for CMS, who have not traditionally acted essentially as a HTA authority outside of this area. Now I would say CMS more broadly, because of the drug price negotiation, is performing more and more of this work. I think the next slide may be back to you, Claire. Let's see. It
Yes.
is.
Cost criterion. So 3 criteria: newness, substantial clinical improvement. We've talked about that. Now cost. People hear cost, they think, okay, we need to prove to CMS that we are going to save Medicare money or that our product is cost effective over the long run. It's not what we're doing. CMS has laid out a very, very specific analysis that we have to do. And they tell us step by step how to do it. I'm not going to go through each of those steps because telling you how to standardize charges, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. I'm going to try and explain it in English so you can kind of get what we're doing in the analysis. The first thing we're doing is we're going into our historical claims data to find the claims where the new technology would have been used had it been available. I say historical claims data, that's from 2 years ago, but that was before the product was on the market. We don't have any claims with the actual product. So we're going back, we're finding the situations where we think the product would have been used. As you might imagine, this is a bit of a creative process. Sometimes we're in the lucky position where, hey, every time this procedure code happens, this is when the product would be used. That makes my life easy. But usually what's happening is we're trying to find a very specific population, a specific type of case where the product is used, and we are looking at claims data that has limited information on it, right? So I have the DRG assignment, I have diagnosis codes, I have procedure codes, I have some other little bits of information like whether the case came in through the ER or whether there was ICU usage. I have the length of stay, but a lot of the really interesting technical, medical, clinical information that would be helpful in finding our right population, I don't have. I don't have what treatments have occurred in the past. I don't have test results. I don't have cancer staging information, all kinds of information that would be really useful in finding our right set of claims. CMS understands that we have to do this sort of creative process. And so in my experience, as long as we are open with them about the assumptions that we're making, as long as we're making reasonable assumptions, as long as it's clear that we're not trying to cherry pick particular expensive cases, they understand that. They understand that they're asking us to do something that is kind of impossible to do. Another way we'll sort of get around this is do things like, hey, we can't find the exact population, but here's a population that's too big. Here's one that's too small. We know we're in the middle, but if we run the cost criterion on these too big and too small, then our Goldilocks situation probably also meets the cost criterion. So first thing we do is we find these cases, and truthfully, I think that's the hardest part of the analysis, and I try to sort of emphasize that that's where we're going to spend the most of our time on, because that's what CMS is really looking at when they are looking at these analyses. Once we get those claims, we then reprice them as if the technology had been used on that claim. So we're adding in the cost of the new technology, we're subtracting out anything that would be replaced by the new technology, and then we're taking those repriced claims, looking at the charges on them, and comparing them to thresholds that CMS has calculated for each DRG. If the charges on those claims exceed the threshold, you meet the cost criterion. It is a yes or no situation. It's not, you're not better off if you meet it by more. If you are above it by $1, you have met the cost criterion. Next slide. Now, as you might imagine, with this sort of strange analysis, there are some quirks to it. I've already sort of talked about the process of trying to find the right set of claims, but there are some other things that I want to point out that are important to think about as you sort of approach this analysis. One, CMS NTAP is only for inpatient hospitalization. So in thinking about the cost criterion, they are only interested in the cost of that hospitalization only. I think commonly manufacturers think about their product, they think about the cost of the product over sort of the care journey of the patient. And I think that's important. But from CMS's perspective, they do not care about costs in the future, additional outpatient visits or physician care. They don't care about stuff in the past. They are only looking at that single hospitalization. Another important note is they really, 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 really want you to use their claims data to do this analysis. Occasionally, someone will try coming in with other types of data, and CMS will really look hard and question those analyses. So, you may sort of say, well, why would we look at these claims data where the product wasn't used when we actually have data in this other situation where the claims were used? Can't we use that? You would think yes, but the answer really is no. The other thing is I keep talking about cost criterion. The funny thing is it's actually looking at hospital charges. And I bring that up because sometimes people will go look up the thresholds that CMS publishes for each DRG, and they'll see a really, really high number, and they'll think, oh my goodness, there is no possible way we will ever meet that. And it's important to know that those numbers are all in charges, which are marked up from cost. CMS gives us very clear instructions about how to do that markup, so we can do that. We're going to take the price of your product and mark it up appropriately, but please don't look at those thresholds and think, oh, we have no chance. There really is, as Ross said, it's easier to meet this than you might think. Finally, a lot of times manufacturers are applying for the NTAP and the product is not on the market yet. So pricing information may not yet be public. In some situations, it may not even be finalized. That's okay. We have ways of dealing with that in this cost criterion. It is not uncommon for us to use sort of a placeholder price for the analysis and then just update the analysis when the product is actually on the market and the pricing is available. CMS is used to that. One other little note, and Ross sort of like suggested this a little bit before, a lot of times these new technologies, they're focusing on really sick patients, the really severe cases. And so when we are selecting those particular severe cases, we may sometimes already meet the cost threshold without even including the technology cost. So truly, if you're thinking about applying for the NTAP and you think, oh, we've got the data, we are new, but yeah, we're really not sure if we're going to meet the cost criterion, I encourage you not to let the cost criterion be the thing that holds you back. It really, Ross will show data showing that the cost criterion is not what is keeping people from getting the NTAP. Next slide. Oh, this is just sort of a graphical depiction of sort of what I just said, so we can go on to the next slide.
Okay, so I'm going to run through this in relatively fast pace, but it's one of my I like data and I like program statistics, and I think you guys will find this helpful. Maybe less so this chart because it feels overwhelming, but this chart ultimately informs a lot of the data we will present. So we've been tracking and reading every single NTAP discussion for the last 20 years, and that helps sort of inform our understanding of how CMS evaluates data and cost and how the program has changed over time. And so I'm going to show you. So this is sort of the raw data on. And forgive me here. There are a couple numbers that are off in a couple of places. But this just shows you sort of the program over. I mean, I think one of the things you'll see over here as you look at the trends is just an overall growth and interest in the program over years. And also, I think a significant delta between the number of manufacturers that apply and the number of applications that are ultimately approved, right? This is not a slam dunk program and so, in essence, about half, a little less than half of enrollees that apply are ultimately successful. I think it's one important thing to note here is a substantial number of manufacturers withdraw either before the proposed rule or after the proposed rule every year because they don't meet the requirement for FDA approval. And those are a little hard category to think about because CMS isn't necessarily judging those particular applications. The other thing I think you'll see on this chart is as you look, and this is one at least graphical way to look at it. Look at those three. Why were applications not denied? Why were they denied? One, recently, the vast majority of reason is because they're not meeting the FDA approval requirement. One of the reasons, by the way, we see that increase in recent years is CMS has made it more stringent on when you needed to be FDA approved by. Previously, you need to be FDA approved by the date of the I think it was
July 1st.
July 1st, and they moved it back 2 months, right? So a number of products got cut off. But overwhelmingly, right, in the history of the program for the last 20 years, only 3 manufacturers were not able to meet the cost threshold, whereas 45 were not able to show substantial clinical improvement, and 22 weren't able to show newness. So I think some really helpful statistics there. You can go, and I will show some fun graphics, although I'm clearly not a graphic designer. So first, sort of increasing number, right, with some obvious variation. The program has grown in interest and popularity. I think it reflects, in my mind, both maybe a couple of things. One, as I'll show you, starting around 2020, I think the real driver of growth there likely is CMS's policy to allow for LPAD, QIDP, and breakthrough devices to no longer show newness and substantial clinical improvement. This may also be by the way what is driving CMS's proposed policy decision. But we certainly have seen a growth in interest in the program, sort of notwithstanding that alternative pathway. Okay, next slide. So I think this is one really important slide, which is new this year, right? Which is, this only shows you 2020 to 2026, and that's because, and this is just number of total approvals. And the reason it starts in 2020 is this is the first year that CMS started to divide applications between alternative and traditional pathways. Interestingly, in 2025 and 2026, the number of applications for the alternative pathway exceeded those from the traditional pathway. Again, so as we think about CMS's potential thinking in its proposal to get rid of this alternative pathway, some of it likely, or maybe all of it, is driven by this idea of, frankly, cost, right? Which is, are we approving too many products now? Did we know this pathway was going to grow as fast as it did? You can go to the next slide. One thing I would say is, by a very large share, the dominant number of approvals under the alternative pathway have been breakthrough medical technologies. There's been, we're actually not showing it here. I think there's only been one LPAD product that has been approved. That product also had a QIDP status, which is why it's not shown here. We see sort of every year there's sort of like 1 to 2 new QIDP products approved, but look at this sort of sustained growth of the last 5 years in the number of breakthrough devices receiving approval, right? So last year, culminating in 20 breakthrough medical devices receiving NTAP approval. Next slide. Here is a show, like this overlaps with number of applications, right? As we've seen the number of applications go up, we've also seen the number of NTAP approvals go up over time. Next slide. And I think this is maybe the most important slide, which shows you the delta between how hard it is for a alternative pathway product to receive approval versus how hard it is for a traditional pathway device. I showed you earlier this statistic that roughly 50% of products are successful in this process. Well, for under the traditional pathway, it's actually a little less than 50%, right? If you look, for example, last year around, 33% of traditional applications that were not withdrawn prior to the process ultimately were able to meet this test for substantial clinical improvement. Close to 100% of LPAD products last year, alternative pathway products were able to be successful. So again, CMS gave a very short statement in the proposed rule on why it was doing this policy, but it did seem to single out this suggestion that, they are concerned that these products are not actually showing substantial clinical improvement. What they didn't say really was this data, which frankly, I think they should have, right? If this is what's driving it, which is they didn't say we're concerned by the high approval rates or the growing approval rates. Claire, anything you want to add, by the way, to this slide?
The other thing that I would say is Ross is right. Their description of why they are making this policy change is very brief. I suspect that they are concerned about increased payments.
Yeah.
NTAP payments are not budget neutral. And so I think that they are concerned. They do an impact analysis each each year to sort of talk about how much spending they're going to do. It is based on predicted numbers. It's not actual. And so I think someone saw these numbers, had a minor heart attack, and said, "We've got to stop this, or we've got to tamp down." And I think actually that's a real problem because I don't think spending is nearly as high as they think it is.
Thanks, Claire. Okay, I think that maybe the last graphic slide I want to go through. Let's see what the next ones are. This one's too hard to follow, but you have it, so you can sort of follow it. This tries to show that, sort of. And then again, this is just limited to the traditional pathway, and it's just another way of showing what I said earlier, which is, the majority of products that ultimately get through the process are eligible, need FDA approval. The primary reason they don't receive NTAP is because they're not able to meet that substantial clinical improvement prong, which again has been historically waived for those alternative pathway devices and QIDP and LPAD products.
And we just had a question about whether an analysis has been done, sort of a retrospective analysis to really compare actual spending versus sort of CMS's impact analysis. It hasn't been done yet. I think that is something that is really worth doing. It's something that I have been itching to do for a while. And I'm wondering if sort of in response to this proposal, if that will be something that comes out.
Yeah, and someone also asked, which is I love hearing interesting research questions. Do you have data on the percentage of alternative pathway breakthrough devices based on FDA approval pathway? I don't, but it's totally doable analysis. Reach out to me, or reach out to Claire. But that sounds like a fun. Again, I think it's fun to like. One of the things I will say here, because we've gotten some questions, sort of like, how likely do we think CMS is to finalize this proposal? One thing I thought was notable is how light CMS was on the discussion here, which suggests to me that there's not a huge movement within the agency to finalize this proposal. And I suspect they're going to hear from a lot of stakeholders on why this is bad. I'm not going to prognosticate here on the webinar, but I think that that's something to take into account. It seems to me that if CMS is going to is heavily invested in a policy, they would have given the kind of data that we're giving to you today on how this program has changed based on its policies. They really have not evaluated, or the kinds of questions you just asked, they really have not evaluated, at least publicly, for stakeholders, the history of this 2020 policy.
I think, though, that it puts people thinking about applying for NTAP in a difficult position because we're not going to know whether they finalize this or not until August. And if you are a breakthrough device or a QIDP or an LPAD wanting to apply in October, pulling together an application that shows you meet all three criteria is a big deal. And I don't think you can wait until August to start that process. And so you sort of have to assume that they're going to
I agree.
Finalize it and start working on your application sooner rather than later.
Thanks, Claire. Okay.
Yeah, so
go ahead, please.
Yeah,
I know we're tight on time. We'll do our best.
Next slide. So we've talked about how they've sort of made some changes over the last couple of years. We can go to the next slide. And I think we've talked a lot about this already. Every year we sort of see stakeholders asking for improvements to the program. Every year we sort of find that CMS does not make those improvements. This year was this real bombshell. And I'm very interested to see sort of the comments that they get and how they respond to that. I'll also note they made a little tweak to the newness criteria. I think it's a tweak rather than a big policy change. So I think generally newness continues to be the same there. Next slide. All right, lessons learned. Next slide. Ross, do you want to hit some of these?
Yeah. So, in our last few minutes, I think we'll just sort of share collectively our experience at a high level, right? So plan, assess, engage, support, educate, right? Plan, now is the time I would say to be thinking about whether or not NTAP is the right program for you. I'm not necessarily saying you need to put pen to paper on an application. And I think Claire brings out a really interesting point, which is more companies may need to do full applications this year than the past based on the fact that waiting until August may be too late to really start to put together substantial clinical improvement arguments for your technology. That's a shame, but there's uncertainty, and I agree with you. I don't know which way this policy will go. Begin to plan. I think one thing that you can also do around time is sort of a feasibility assessment. Is there any gating issues to us receiving NTAP? Assess the resources. One of the things I love about these projects is they are cross-disciplinary across an organization. We need buy-in from medical. We need buy-in from legal affairs. We need buy-in from regulatory. And so start to identify both your internal team as well as your external support that will be used to help assist this application, run the cost threshold analysis, et cetera. Plan to engage throughout the process. Your job does not end when the application is submitted. Don't forget you need to get an ICD-10 procedure code application in, and don't forget there is a success or failure often depends on the kind of engagement you have during the comment period. Consider building support. I think this is a missed opportunity for many, which is having key opinion leaders, specialty societies, patients chime in as part of the public comment process is another great way to build support for your application. And then once you get NTAP, your work doesn't end. I think this is another really important piece here, right? Which is not all hospitals are familiar with NTAP. Not all hospitals have great communication between their pharmacy departments and the actual providers. Not everyone knows to use the ICD-10 procedure code on your claim. So part of your market access outreach education is going to need to involve educating your providers on the NTAP program. Next slide.
We've talked about a lot of these limitations already, but things that I really want to point out. Hospitals don't know ahead of time what their payment's going to be. And that is a barrier. I think also temporary, we've certainly talked about that. We've talked about how this is limited to Medicare fee-for-service only. Medicare Advantage, Medicaid, private payers, they don't get the NTAP. So when you're thinking about, hey, is this worth it for us? Know that the NTAP is only going to be on claims that are Medicare, traditional Medicare claims. And then we talked about sort of education. Next slide. So,
go ahead, Claire, please. You should do it.
So we have this Center for Medicare New Tech team. The thing that I want to sort of say about my experience working with them is that they are legitimately trying to figure this out. They are working very hard. They are going to check every citation that you provide. They are really trying to understand the situation. The other thing to know is that there are medical reviewers, but the sort of main person looking at your application is a policy person. So when you are writing your NTAP application, you absolutely need to provide all of the data. But I think that applications that have a better chance of success are the ones that are able to sort of put it in English or provide a story or an argument that can be understood more widely. It's not just a clinician
really good point.
Looking at percentages and outcomes and things like that. So, and I also think that they really are open, if new data comes out after you've submitted your application, they want to get it. They want to have all the information possible. This is not a sort of, we are looking for ways, as much as we've talked about how they seem to be sort of trying to close down the program, they are not trying to just do a gotcha, no, we're not going to grant this. They're really trying to figure it out. Ross, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
No, that's great. So maybe let's just sort of end with some do's and don'ts. With some caveats I made early, engage, lean into this process. As data develops throughout the process, if it's not included in your initial application, there's an opportunity in December to provide additional supplemental information. Really anticipate critical feedback during the proposed rule comment period and respond to that feedback. CMS is asking these questions because they want more data, more information. Give them what they need to say yes, and identify those external and internal champions. Don't just think the process ends when you begin. Don't a couple of other smaller pieces here. We have another slide. I don't want to make sure this is our last. This may be it. Is this it? Suffice to say, many of you have already probably navigated CMS's new electronic application system, which has been used for a couple of years. There's some quirks associated with it, including word count issues that I urge you to give yourself ample time to enter it into the application.
Yes.
And so I think
That's
we come
it.
to our end. Yeah.
Yes, we have barreled through a lot of information. I hope that it has been interesting. I hope it has been helpful. As I said, 72-hour rule, you will get the slides, you will get the recording, and please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We are more than happy. You can probably tell we're a little passionate about this program. We love answering questions. So thank you all for coming, and hope that we will be hearing from you with any questions. Thanks all.